Imagine this. A strategic body, 27 nations strong, essentially paralyzed on the world stage. Because uh, one single country, Hungary, has consistently blocked the security and foreign policy moves of the entire European Union. And this obstruction, it's not just slowing down Ukraine's bid to join, it's forcing the EU into a really impossible choice. Stick to its own legal values or act decisively as a global power, even crazier. The EU's financial muscle, the money meant to punish countries sliding away from democracy, that's been flipped on its head. It's become a tool for Hungary to actually extract billions. Welcome to Nation Scope Podcast. Join Jordan and Jamie as they dive into the latest headlines, breaking stories, and critical events shaping America and the world. From politics to culture, from the economy to technology, they analyze the news that matters most.
Yeah, and today we're going beyond just the headlines. We want to unpack Viktor Orbán's real geopolitical thinking here. This plan he seems to have to stop what he calls an American-Polish axis from rising within the EU. And we'll also dig into why the EU's ultimate weapon against him, this nuclear option, is, well, basically politically impossible to use. So stick with us as we try to make sense of this unfolding global crisis.
Okay, let's unpack this then. This whole crisis around Ukraine's membership talks, it seems to have gone from being maybe an annoying diplomatic issue to what people are now calling a fundamental crisis of institutional capability. Why is Ukraine's potential membership suddenly framed as the EU's most significant geopolitical investment, not just, another bureaucratic step?
Well, it's a complete game changer, really, driven by the 2022 invasion. Before that, enlargement was, maybe more administrative, but post-invasion, it became a core security necessity for the whole continent. For the EU, bringing Ukraine closer, or eventually in, is about projecting stability eastward, securing that flank, and building a unified bloc strong enough to stand up to powers like Russia.
Right, so the blockage isn't just about whether Ukraine's ready or not. It actually hits the EU's core ability to act as one on the world stage. It's a real stress test for the whole system. But, some might say, isn't this just politics as usual, hardball tactics? Why should we see this specific obstruction as a crisis of the institution itself?
Because the external problem, the veto on Ukraine, is really just a symptom of a much deeper internal issue that's been brewing for a long time. We're talking a decade of what's called democratic backsliding in Hungary. I mean, the European Parliament itself now calls it an electoral autocracy. So Orbán isn't just negotiating terms here. He's actually weaponizing the EU's foreign policy tools to protect his own system back home, the one that's clashing with EU values. The veto becomes a shield.
Okay. That collection, the internal democratic issues directly causing external foreign policy blocks, that's key. But let's switch to the mechanics for a second. Getting into the EU, it sounds like one big negotiation, but the sources we looked at paint it as more of a procedural minefield. If they somehow get past this current hurdle, how many other chances does Hungary legally get to slam the door later on?
Oh, plenty. And that's the structural weakness that makes these short-term fixes feel so inadequate. The whole path to membership is laid out in Article 49 of the main EU treaty. And it's not just one vote. It's like a maze with at least 6 separate points where everyone has to agree. Unanimity. That gives any one country, like Hungary, huge leverage, potentially for years, even decades. Let's just walk through it quickly because the number of choke points is kind of amazing. First off, you need everyone to agree just to grant candidate status.
Okay. Step 1, unanimous. Got it.
Then there's a really critical early step, unanimously adopting the negotiating framework. That's the blueprint for the talks. Without that, you can't even start the real discussions.
And where are we right now? Where's the current logjam?
We're now into the nitty-gritty negotiating phase. EU law is split into about 35 policy areas or chapters, grouped into 6 big clusters. And guess what? The decision to open and close each of those clusters needs another unanimous vote every single time. Right now, Hungary is specifically blocking the opening of the key fundamentals cluster for Ukraine and Moldova.
Well, you said clusters and chapters. So even if they somehow agree to open a whole cluster, they still have to get unanimous agreement to close each of the, 33 to 35 individual chapters inside it? That sounds exhausting.
It is. It's designed for maximum potential blockage, frankly. And then way down the road, maybe decades from now, you have the final big hurdles. First, a unanimous vote in the council to actually approve the final accession treaty. And then the biggest one of all, national ratification. Every single EU member state has to approve it through their own national parliaments or referendums.
Wow. So this current fight over the fundamentals cluster, it's just the very first hurdle in a long, long race. Even if they muscle through this one, Hungary legally keeps the power to say no again and again for years. That really hammers home why just finding a quick political fix right now isn't enough. Okay, this is where it gets really fascinating, I think. Let's move past the procedures and talk about why.
Hmm.
What are Hungary's public reasons for the veto versus the deeper strategic fears that are apparently discussed behind closed doors?
Well, the public arguments are pretty standard stuff. Systemic corruption in Ukraine, they say it's just not ready. Financial burden, they claim Ukraine joining would soak up way too much farm money, 10 times what Hungary gets. There's also the security line arguing that bringing in a country at war means integrating the war into the EU. And, of course, the issue of rights for the Hungarian minority in Ukraine's Transcarpathia region. These all sound like, well, negotiable policy points.
But the real engine driving this, according to these sources, is something much more strategic. Tell us about this Orbán Doctrine.
Right. This is what comes out in more private diplomatic settings. The core fear, Orbán's deep worry, is that Ukraine joining would permanently create a new dominant power center within the EU. And crucially, one he sees as completely subservient to the United States.
So he's afraid of the internal balance of power shifting dramatically.
Exactly. He specifically fears an American-Polish axis. Think the Baltic states, Poland, Ukraine, maybe Romania becoming this very strong, very pro-U.S. bloc. His calculation seems to be that this group would eventually become militarily and economically more influential than the old Franco-German engine that's traditionally steered the EU.
And why is that specific shift such a fundamental threat to Hungary's own strategy?
Because it basically blows up Hungary's entire model. Orbán sees Hungary as a strategic bridge positioned to benefit from strong ties with both the East, meaning Russia and China, and the West. If a powerful, very pro-Western eastern flank emerges and pulls the whole EU more firmly into that camp, well, his balancing act becomes impossible. His friendly stance towards Russia becomes completely untenable inside the bloc. So this isn't just a negotiation tactic over farm subsidies. It's about defending the structural basis of his entire foreign economic policy.
Okay, so the veto isn't transactional in the usual sense, like arguing over fishing quotas or something. It's strategic. It's existential for his vision. It's about freezing the EU's current power dynamics, because that's what gives him room to maneuver.
That's the crucial point, I think. It's ideological and structural. And that's why looking back at old disputes like Greece and North Macedonia over the name or Slovenia and Croatia over borders, those solutions don't apply. Those were solvable bilateral issues. This is different.
Right. So if this obstruction really is such a threat to the EU's credibility and ability to act, why can't they just change the rules or punish Hungary effectively? Why does the EU's toolkit seem so, well, empty?
Well, now we hit the legal paradoxes, the catch-22s baked into the EU treaties. Take the idea of moving to qualified majority voting QMV for opening these negotiation clusters instead of needing unanimity. Sounds sensible, right? Stops one country holding up 26.
Yeah, seems like the obvious fix.
It does. But here's the paradox. To change the rules of the negotiating framework to allow QMV, that change itself requires a unanimous decision by all 27 member states. So Hungary would literally have to agree to give up its own veto power. It's like asking turkeys to vote for Christmas. It makes actually activating that change incredibly difficult, maybe impossible right now.
Okay, wow. And what about the ultimate threat, the nuclear option, Article 7, that's supposed to allow suspending voting rights for breaking core EU values? They started that process against Hungary years ago, didn't they? Why can't they just push it through?
That's another dead end, legally speaking. To get to the really tough part of Article 7, the sanctions, the suspension of voting rights, you need a unanimous decision, minus Hungary itself, that there's been a serious and persistent breach of EU values. Unanimous. And with countries like Slovakia now likely to back Hungary, getting all the other member states to agree is seen as politically unreachable. The bar is just too high.
So the EU is basically trapped. It can't use its strongest legal tools, so it's forced into these weaker political signals, like setting up parallel negotiation tracks, things that show support but don't actually break the legal deadlock.
Exactly. These soft options, they keep some technical work going in Kyiv. They send a signal that Ukraine isn't forgotten, but they have no legal force on their own. They can't override the requirement for all 27 member states to agree on the formal steps.
So let's connect the dots here. We have the fight over the rule of law, the democratic backsliding, and the veto on Ukraine's accession. And it's all tangled up now with money. Explain this hostage-taking dynamic. How did Hungary manage to flip the script on financial leverage?
Right. Initially, the EU froze billions, something like 18 to 22 billion in various funds because of these deep concerns about Hungary's judicial independence, anti-corruption measures, things like that. The idea was classic leverage. Fix these problems, you get the money. But Hungary's response was, frankly, quite clever, if cynical. They immediately started using their veto power on critical foreign policy stuff. Ukraine aid, sanctions on Russia, essentially saying, unfreeze our money or we block everything. We saw a really clear example of this back in December 2023. Hungary was threatening to veto both the start of Ukraine's accession talks and a huge $50 billion aid package Kyiv desperately needed. Under immense pressure, the European Commission controversially released $10.2 billion of those frozen funds, pointing to some arguably superficial judicial reforms Hungary had made.
Did they really think that that release would actually solve the underlying problem?
It seems like it was a calculated gamble, maybe born out of desperation. But the outcome immediately showed who had the upper hand. Right after that $10.2 billion was unblocked, Orbán did allow the accession talks decision to go through, but he did it by literally walking out of the room during the vote, so technically he didn't vote against it. And then almost immediately he turned around and vetoed the $50 billion aid package anyway. It perfectly illustrated the reversal. Hungary forced the EU to compromise on its core values to achieve an urgent foreign policy goal and then just move the goalposts again.
And you're saying this is totally different from past EU enlargement disputes?
Completely different. Those older disputes like Greece versus North Macedonia or Slovenia versus Croatia, they were ultimately about specific bilateral issues, a name, a borderline. They could be resolved eventually through negotiation or arbitration. Orbán's veto isn't about a single solvable issue. It's ideological, it's structural, it's about protecting his domestic system and fundamentally reshaping the EU's geopolitical orientation. The old diplomatic tools just don't work here. So the final assessment really is that this whole crisis is forcing a reckoning, a really painful one, about the future of unanimity in EU foreign policy. The EU is caught in a strategic bind. These softer options, parallel tracks, they keep things moving for Kyiv, which is important, but they don't fix the underlying institutional flaw that lets one member state hijack the entire bloc's agenda.
And maybe the most worrying potential outcome from all this isn't just deadlock, but the EU slowly evolving into a kind of 26+1 system, where groups of willing countries just start doing things outside the formal treaties, funding aid through separate agreements, coordinating security policy without involving the Council. What's the long-term risk if that kind of fragmentation takes hold? Does it start to undermine the whole legal foundation, the unity of the entire European project?
That's the big fear. It risks hollowing out the central institutions and eroding the legal consistency that the Union is built on. It's a serious long-term danger.
You've been listening to NationScope Podcast, where Jordan and Jamie analyze the stories shaping America and the world. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.